In the heart of the city, under a relentless downpour, fate twisted the life of billionaire William Harrington. After decades spent building an empire, he'd come to know the weight of wealth's silence. And yet that night, a chance encounter on a cold, rain-soaked street would bring his past crashing back to him. As the rain fell, so did a veil he'd kept tightly drawn over the only love he'd ever lost. It was nearly midnight when William Harrington finally left his office. The city's lights cast fragmented reflections in the wet pavement as he strode toward his car. His world, measured in numbers and spreadsheets, was far removed from the shadows and struggles of those on the streets. But tonight, something caught his eye. A young woman hunched under the dim, flickering streetlight, cradling a bundled baby close to her chest. The woman's posture was tight, as if protecting the infant from more than just the chill. Her clothes were worn thin, her face lined with fatigue. Her eyes darted around in nervous glances. She didn't seem like a regular street dweller. There was something different, almost misplaced about her desperation. William paused, standing back in the darkness, watching. The woman shifted on her feet, shivering as raindrops beaded in her tangled hair. Her thin hands clasped the baby's head, rubbing gently as she murmured quiet words of comfort. But it wasn't the scene itself that held William captive. It was a haunting familiarity in her face, something that tugged at the edges of his memory. As he observed her, images of another time surfaced, a time when he was a different man. He felt a pang of sorrow, unbidden, as the memory of Eleanor, the woman he once loved, filled his mind. It had been years since he'd allowed himself to think of her, to feel the regret that followed him like a ghost. Yet tonight, it lingered close, as real as the rain. Against his usual instincts, William found himself stepping forward. His hands reached into his coat pocket, pulling out his wallet as he approached her. "Miss, please, take this," he offered, holding out several bills. The young woman looked up, startled, her grip tightening around her child as her eyes met his. For a moment, she didn't respond. Her gaze locked on him with a mix of relief and hesitation, as if considering whether to accept the kindness of a stranger. She looked down at the baby, then back at William, a flicker of doubt crossing her face. "Just take it," he said, gentler this time, nodding toward the baby. "It'll help." Reluctantly, she took the money, her hand trembling as she muttered, "Thank you." William reached into his pocket again, pulling out his business card. "If you need a safe place to stay, contact me. I can arrange something for you and the child." The words surprised him as he spoke them. It wasn't like him to get involved. He'd built his life on distance, insulating himself from the needs and emotions of others. But tonight felt different, as if something or someone was pulling him forward. The woman accepted the card, but her eyes held a glint of resistance, a guarded look that struck him as unusual. It was almost as if she had some unspoken reason for being exactly where she was. Her expression, worn and shadowed as it was, held a note of recognition that made his heart stammer. She nodded slowly, whispering a hesitant "thank you," before glancing down at the baby, whose striking blue eyes stared up at him, with an intensity that left him speechless. William felt a jolt, his breath catching as he studied the child's eyes. For a fleeting moment, he was sure he'd seen those eyes before, eyes that stirred something buried deep within him. The sensation was unsettling, a strange familiarity that made him uneasy. His mind reeled with questions, yet he didn't dare ask. He merely nodded and took a step back, his hand clenched tightly around his briefcase. The woman turned, clutching the baby close, her figure slowly fading into the darkened street, rain pouring down around her. The rain had barely ceased by morning, when William Harrington found himself haunted by the woman's face and the child's piercing eyes. It was a strange pull, an irrational compulsion. Yet it kept tugging at him through the night, as if the quiet desperation he'd seen on that dark street held an echo of his past. After their brief encounter, William couldn't simply move on. He had arranged for his assistant, Linda, to reach out and secure a small, discreet lodging for the woman and her baby. It was an unusual step for a man so entrenched in his own life, someone who rarely diverted his gaze from work to dwell on the lives of strangers. Yet here he was, arranging food and shelter for someone he barely knew. Perhaps it was the child's eyes, or the familiarity in the woman's haunted expression, or maybe it was something he hadn't dared to confront until now. As he left the details with Linda, he found himself drawn to his private office, his thoughts lingering on memories he'd long tried to bury. Settling into his chair, he let his mind drift back 25 years, to a time when life was vibrant, full of the promises of youth. That's when he had met Eleanor, the woman he thought would share his future. Her laughter, like a balm to his ambitious soul, had made him feel alive. She'd spoken of dreams and plans that he had back then, imagined building with her. But life's course had twisted. Eleanor was gone, and with her, he had buried every trace of who he once was, pouring himself into his business as if it were the only thing he'd ever loved. Now those memories came back with a force that shook him. The woman's eyes, had they truly looked so much like Eleanor's? Later that afternoon, Linda returned with a curious look on her face, clutching something small and weathered. "Mr. Harrington," she said carefully, "we found this with her belongings." She handed him a locket, aged and tarnished, its delicate clasp barely holding together. As his fingers traced the familiar etching, his heart raced. He knew this locket. It had once belonged to Eleanor. He'd given it to her on a chilly winter evening, a promise of his devotion back when he had believed in forever. Opening the locket, he saw the small, faded photograph inside, a picture of Eleanor in her youth, her soft smile captured eternally. His breath caught as he looked closer. How could this woman, this stranger on the street, be carrying something so personal? Something tied so intimately to a part of his life he thought was lost. It was as if fate itself had conspired to draw him into this mystery. A mystery that felt all too real, all too connected. How could she have come into possession of Eleanor's locket? And why now, after all these years? A rush of questions flooded his mind, but one thing was certain, he had to know more. He couldn't ignore the suspicion that grew with each passing second. Eleanor's memory, a memory he'd locked away for a quarter of a century, had been pulled from its resting place. Compelled by an unrelenting curiosity, William asked Linda to dig deeper. He needed every piece of information he could gather about the woman, her origins, her life, and most importantly, how she had come into possession of Eleanor's locket. Linda nodded, understanding the unspoken intensity in his request, and set out to investigate further. As the hours stretched into the evening, William couldn't shake the feeling that this woman, this stranger who seemed to hold echoes of Eleanor, had more to reveal. He began piecing through memories in his own mind, revisiting moments he had locked away in the deepest recesses of his heart. Flashbacks of his days with Eleanor played out vividly in his thoughts, moments that still bore the sting of loss. One memory in particular surfaced, the night he had promised to always be there for her. They had been sitting under the stars, Eleanor's hand warm in his as she told him her dreams of a future together. But he had let that promise slip away, consumed by ambition and the ceaseless demands of his empire. And when tragedy had struck, it had taken her from him before he'd had the chance to make amends, to keep his word. Now, as he looked at the worn locket, the guilt of that broken promise returned with a vengeance, reminding him of what he'd lost and of the life he had abandoned in his pursuit of success. Driven by a need to find closure, William resolved to visit the place where he had last said goodbye to Eleanor, her grave. The idea stirred something within him, a feeling he hadn't acknowledged in years. He needed answers. Not only for himself, but for the lingering presence of Eleanor that seemed to have resurrected itself through this mysterious woman. At dawn, William made his way to the cemetery, his steps slow and uncertain as he approached Eleanor's resting place. He hadn't been here in years, avoiding it as if distance could erase the pain, as if he could simply move on without looking back. But now, as he stood there in the morning mist, memories surged forth unbidden, filling the silence around him. The chill of the morning seeped into William's bones as he stood at Eleanor's grave, his mind racing with fragments of memories, questions, and regrets. The rain had stopped, but a gray fog settled around him, thick and dense, blurring the gravestones like ghosts watching over him. Then he saw her again, the woman from the night before, holding her baby and looking at Eleanor's grave, with a sorrow so profound, it cut through him. William's first instinct was disbelief, followed closely by something more primal, more raw, a sense of loss mixed with anger. This stranger, this woman, stood before Eleanor's grave, her face pale, her eyes hollow. She clutched the child as if he were the last thing tethering her to the world. For a moment, William felt as though he'd walked into a different life, a parallel existence where his past had never ended, only continued without him. "What are you doing here?" William asked, his voice sharper than he'd intended. The woman flinched, but didn't look away. Her eyes were filled with something between shame and resignation, an expression that hinted at a story she'd been carrying alone for too long. "My mother," she started, her voice cracking slightly. She swallowed and tried again. "Eleanor was my mother." The words hung between them, heavy and unyielding. William's breath caught in his throat. He'd come here seeking answers, but this was beyond anything he could have imagined. Eleanor had a daughter? He glanced down at the locket still clutched in his hand, the familiar, worn metal now feeling like a key to a locked door he hadn't known existed. Who are you?" he managed, the weight of her revelation settling uneasily within him. "My name is Grace," she replied quietly, her gaze lowering. I've been trying to survive since she passed. She never spoke much about you, only that you were someone important to her once. I found the locket among her things after she died. I don't know why, but when I lost everything, I thought maybe this city, her memory, might somehow save us." She glanced down at the baby, cradling him protectively. William stared at her, his mind reeling with questions he was almost afraid to ask. He felt a flood of emotions he hadn't experienced in years. Anger and sorrow, curiosity and guilt, all intertwined, too tightly wound to untangle. He took a step back, needing space to absorb the weight of her words, the possibility that Eleanor had led a life without him, had raised a daughter. His heart skipped at the thought. "Your mother," he began, his voice softening, "was the love of my life. We planned a future together, but—" He hesitated, feeling the old wound tear open, as raw as it had been decades ago. "But I lost her, and then I lost myself in a life that left no room for anyone else." Grace looked up, meeting his gaze, her own eyes mirroring his pain. "She tried to forget you, I think, but she never could. She'd sometimes mention you in bits and pieces, as if you were a memory too precious to hold but too painful to let go. She never remarried. She poured herself into raising me." She paused, her grip tightening on the baby. "And now it's just me and Elliot." The name struck William with a strange familiarity, a resonance that echoed in his heart. He looked at the baby, whose tiny face was watching him with those piercing blue eyes. A thought crossed his mind, tentative and terrifying. Was it possible? "Elliot," he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "Grace, do you know who his father is?" She hesitated, her face clouding. "His father left us, abandoned us, with no way of finding him. I don't even know where he is. I came here because I thought maybe something of my mother's memory could help me feel close to her again, that maybe I could find some strength. But I'm alone. Elliot and I are alone." The vulnerability in her voice broke something within William. In that moment, he saw Eleanor, not just in her daughter's face, but in her fierce determination to survive, her quiet strength. He felt an unshakable sense of duty, of responsibility, not only to Grace, but to the memory of Eleanor that had been locked away inside him. He knelt beside Grace, his eyes level with hers, and spoke softly. "You're not alone anymore, Grace. You and Elliot, your family, and if there's anything I can do to help, I will. I promise." A tear slipped down Grace's cheek, her expression one of disbelief and relief. She looked at him, as if seeing a lifeline for the first time in years, as if a spark of hope had finally cut through the darkness surrounding her. "I don't know what this means," William continued, his voice wavering slightly. "But I do know that I have to make things right. I can't change what happened, but I can be here now. For you and for Elliot. It's the least I can do for Eleanor and for the promises I couldn't keep." Grace nodded, her hand reaching for his. They sat in silence for a moment, two souls bound by grief and an unexpected connection. For William, the cemetery no longer felt like a place of loss. It was now a place of new beginnings, of redemption, a bridge between the past he had lost and a future he had never imagined. As he held Grace's hand, he looked down at Elliot once more, the child's blue eyes staring up at him with an expression of pure innocence. And for the first time in decades, William felt something stir within him, a feeling of purpose, of hope, and perhaps a chance to finally heal the wounds that Eleanor had left behind. In the dim light of his study, William sat alone, gripped by memories he had tried so hard to escape. The life he had buried, the love he had lost, all of it flooded back as he thought of Grace's story, of her mother, Eleanor, and of Elliot, the child whose eyes seemed to hold a piece of him. He had wealth, success, a life envied by many, yet here he was, tormented by the years he'd lost, years he could never reclaim. As the days went by, William found himself haunted by what might have been. The thought of Eleanor raising a daughter alone, her life filled with hardships, gnawed at him. He could see her so clearly now, the young woman she had been, full of dreams, her laughter ringing in his ears as if it were yesterday. But those dreams, the life they had planned, had faded into memories that lay buried beneath his ambition and wealth. How blind he had been, believing success could fill the void her absence had left. One evening, Grace came to him, her face drawn, eyes weary, the burden of her secrets finally too much to bear. She looked at him as if seeing through the powerful, composed exterior he'd cultivated, and in a quiet voice, she began her story. "After you left, my mother, she struggled," she said, her voice catching. "She tried to move on, to forget, but I think losing you broke something in her. She kept it from me when I was young, tried to be strong, but as I got older, I saw it in her eyes, the sadness that never really left. She built a life for us the best she could, working endless hours, doing anything she could to make ends meet." William's throat tightened. He could almost see Eleanor, working tirelessly, her love for her daughter sustaining her through each day. But the thought of her enduring so much pain he could have prevented, sent a surge of regret crashing over him. "She gave up so much for me," Grace continued, her gaze distant. "She didn't remarry, didn't let herself fall in love again. She devoted everything she had to raising me. She never let me see how hard it was, but as I grew older, I could tell. She was trying to protect me, to give me a good life, no matter the cost to herself." William felt a pang of guilt so intense it was almost physical. The young woman before him was a living testament to Eleanor's strength and love, a reminder of the life he could have shared with her. Had he been there, had he made different choices? Grace's voice softened as she looked down, clutching Elliot closer. "But life wasn't kind to her. She got sick, slowly at first. I think she hid it from me as long as she could. When I finally found out, it was too late. She held on as long as she could, but she couldn't keep fighting forever." Her words echoed in the silence, each one another nail in the coffin of William's regrets. Eleanor had died alone, struggling to give her daughter the life they had once dreamed of building together. And he had been nowhere to be found. "I'm sorry, Grace," he whispered, his voice raw with remorse. "I'm so sorry I wasn't there. I should have been there for both of you." Grace nodded slowly, her expression softening, though her eyes remained distant. "I know. She forgave you, in her own way, I think. She would never speak ill of you, not even once, and she kept the locket, as if it was all she had left of you." William felt a shudder run through him, the weight of her words settling deep into his heart. "I don't deserve that forgiveness, Grace. She deserved so much better." Grace sighed, her hand instinctively moving to Elliot, her son, as if to draw strength from his presence. Life didn't get any easier after she passed. I met someone I thought could be there for me, give Elliot a family. Her voice trembled, and she paused, gathering herself. But it wasn't like that. He hurt me, hurt us. I stayed as long as I could, thinking it would get better, thinking I had no choice. But when he turned his anger on Elliot, I couldn't stay. I took what I could and ran. Her words hit William like a storm, each revelation a blow to his soul. He couldn't comprehend the suffering Grace had endured, the desperation that had driven her to flee with nothing but her son, and a hope that her mother's memory would be enough to give her strength. He felt anger rise within him, anger at the man who had hurt her, anger at himself for not being there sooner. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice barely audible. "I can't imagine what you've been through." She looked at him, a hint of defiance in her eyes, mixed with vulnerability. "I don't want pity. I came here because I thought maybe being near my mother, near her memory, would help me find some kind of strength to keep going." William nodded, understanding. This was more than a mother's memory for Grace. It was the last tether to a life she had once known, to a love that had carried her mother through even the darkest of days. "You're safe now, Grace," he said, his voice steady, filled with a resolve he hadn't felt in years. "You and Elliot both. I'll do whatever it takes to protect you, to give you the life Eleanor would have wanted you to have." She looked at him, the fight in her eyes softening, replaced by something fragile and hopeful. For the first time since she had arrived, she allowed herself to lean on him, to let go of the weight she had been carrying alone. In that moment, William realized he had been given a second chance, not just to make amends, but to honor the memory of the woman he had loved, by caring for the family she had left behind. Eleanor might have been gone, but her legacy was here, standing before him, reminding him of the love that had once been his, and the family he still had a chance to hold on to. As they sat in silence, William reached over, his hand gently resting on Elliot's tiny hand, feeling the warmth and the promise of new beginnings. And for the first time in decades, he felt the weight of his isolation begin to lift, replaced by something he thought he'd lost forever, the chance for redemption and the hope of a family. The house was quiet as the morning light poured through the windows, casting gentle warmth across the room where William sat with Grace and little Elliot. It had been weeks since that fateful encounter in the rain, yet the transformation in his life was already more profound than anything he could have imagined. For so long, he had drifted through his days, cloaked in wealth, yet bereft of purpose. But now, for the first time in years, he felt the stirrings of something he'd believed long dead, a sense of family, of love, of redemption. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, William's life began to fill with the presence of Grace and Elliot. His once empty mansion, cold and echoing with the sounds of a solitary life, now hummed with a gentle, unfamiliar warmth. At first it was small things, Grace's laughter as she played with Elliot in the garden, the soft murmurs of her bedtime stories drifting down the hall. William would sit nearby, watching, an outsider in his own home, learning what it meant to be part of something bigger than himself. One morning, as they shared breakfast, William took a breath, his voice soft but resolute. "Grace, I know I can never replace the life you lost, or take back the pain you've endured. But if you'll let me, I want to be here for you, for Elliot, to help you build a life that's worthy of Eleanor's memory." Grace looked up, surprise and gratitude in her eyes. She had spent years on her own, relying on nothing but her own resilience and her mother's memory. To have someone now offering her a future, offering her support, was something she never thought possible. She nodded, unable to find the words, but William understood. Together, they began to shape a life around the echoes of the past and the promise of the future. William set up housing for Grace, a small, beautiful apartment where she could have the stability she had longed for. He introduced her to a therapist, someone gentle yet firm, who could help her unpack the trauma she had carried for so long. The process was slow, and there were days when Grace would retreat into herself, the weight of her memories too much to bear. But William was there, a quiet presence, steady and unyielding, giving her the space to heal. And for Elliot, William found himself embracing a role he had never envisioned, that of a grandfather. At first it was awkward, a man who had long shut himself off from others, now suddenly responsible for a small child with boundless curiosity. But Elliot, with his innocent questions and tiny hands reaching out, began to melt the barriers William had placed around his heart. They would spend afternoons in the garden, Elliot tugging at William's hand, pointing at flowers and leaves with wonder. One evening, as William tucked Elliot in, the boy looked up at him, eyes sleepy but filled with trust. "Will you stay, Grandpa?" he asked softly, the words slipping out naturally, instinctively. William felt a tear slip down his cheek as he nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Elliot, I'll stay. I'll always be here." The word Grandpa had taken him by surprise, but he realized how much he needed to hear it. How much he had missed the opportunity to be someone's family. With Elliot, he could be the grandfather he'd never known he wanted to be, and with Grace, he could be the support Eleanor had needed him to be. Determined to honor Eleanor's legacy, William founded a charitable organization in her memory, dedicated to helping single mothers and families escape abusive situations. He poured not only his wealth, but his heart into the project. Driven by a desire to finally fulfill the promises he had once made to Eleanor. He named it Eleanor's Promise, a place where women like Grace could find shelter, resources, and a path forward. The foundation grew rapidly, and William became known not just as a billionaire, but as a man who had finally found his purpose in helping others. One afternoon, as he walked through the foundation's newly opened shelter, William felt an overwhelming sense of peace. There, in every room filled with warmth and hope, he saw Eleanor's memory come to life. She had given him the strength to change, to be a better man, and in doing so he had found a new family, one bound not by blood, but by love, by redemption. Back at home, as Grace watched her son play, she turned to William, her expression soft and filled with gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "For Elliot, for me, for my mother." William shook his head, his voice steady, carrying years of unspoken emotion. "It's not about thanks, Grace. It's about honoring the love your mother and I shared. It's about making up for the years I lost and giving you and Elliot a life that Eleanor would have wanted for you. This is my way of finally keeping my promise." Grace's eyes glistened with tears, and she nodded, understanding the depth of his words. In that moment, she felt her mother's presence, the love that had once bound her parents together, now woven into the life she and her son were building with William. She took his hand, a gesture of gratitude, of forgiveness, of family. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden light across the garden, William watched Grace and Elliot, his heart full in a way he hadn't thought possible. He had found redemption, not in grand gestures, but in the quiet moments of family, of love that had transcended loss and pain. And for the first time in his life, he felt complete. A man who had finally come home. The sky was overcast, a gentle breeze stirring the leaves, as William and Grace walked side by side through the cemetery, little Elliot clinging to his mother's hand. In their arms, they carried a bouquet of Eleanor's favorite flowers, lilies and lilacs, their soft fragrance filling the air as they approached her grave. This was a visit long overdue, a tribute to a woman whose love had left a legacy none of them had foreseen. As they reached Eleanor's resting place, William knelt by the grave. Placing the flowers gently on the stone, his fingers brushing over the etched words of her name. Grace joined him, her face softened with remembrance, and together they sat in a peaceful silence, each lost in their thoughts, each honoring the woman who had shaped their lives in profound ways. With a deep, steadying breath, William spoke, his voice filled with warmth, regret, gratitude, and love. "Eleanor," he whispered, I should have been here sooner. I should have been the one to hold your hand, to share your burdens. But know this, I won't let you down again. I'll look after Grace, and I'll watch over Elliot, just as I know you would have wanted." Grace nodded, reaching out to place a hand on William's shoulder. "Mom would be proud of you," she said softly. "She always believed in you, even after all those years." They shared stories then, quiet, tender memories of Eleanor. They laughed at the small things, the way she would hum when she was lost in thought, her fondness for early morning walks, and the kindness she showed everyone around her. William found himself lost in those memories, each one a piece of the woman he had loved and lost, a woman whose legacy now lived on in Grace and Elliot. After a few quiet moments, William straightened, a sense of peace settling over him, lighter than he had felt in decades. He turned to Grace, his voice resolute. "Eleanor gave us both a second chance, and I intend to honor her for the rest of my life. I have my family back, not the one I imagined, but the one I now realize I was meant to have." In that moment, William felt a calm he hadn't known in years. The echoes of his past regrets faded, replaced by a sense of fulfillment he thought he'd lost long ago. Life, he had learned, rarely follows the paths we envision. Yet here he was, given a second chance, to honor a love he had once let slip away, to mend the wounds he had left untended. And for the first time, he could look forward, knowing he was no longer alone. We've all had moments of loss, of missed chances, and of regret. But what would you do if life gave you a second chance to make things right? What would you say to someone you loved if you had one more opportunity to speak to them? Let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts on William's journey. What would you have done in his place? Thank you for joining us in this heartfelt story of redemption and family. If you enjoyed this journey, make sure to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more stories that stir the soul and engage.